I need to use it for recording. Okay, fair enough. Well, first of all, thank you for having me here. It's really a great privilege to be invited to speak at your Members' Day. One thing I don't know is how to change my slides.
I'm going to show you.
Okay, thank you. Because otherwise we're not going to go very far. Something I want to say I was very pleased is that I didn't realize that I was going to be on the front page of your magazine with my dog, which is brilliant because when I usually send this picture to conferences, they think it's not serious enough and discard it and ask me to take some serious one sitting at my desk. But given that we're talking about hope and mental health, my dog is one of the members of the family that greatly contributes to my mental health. So I think she's right to be next to me on your front cover. There we go. So I'm going to talk to you about something that is very central, not only to my clinical work, but also to my, thank you very much, my research work. Thank you. So, first of all, I like to start, because sometimes you get to the end rushing to a talk and you don't have time to thank the people that have made what I'm going to talk to you about possible. So, all the data we'll be presenting are the result of young people who suffer psychosis for the first time, devoting hours of their time to engage in our research, and equally, lots of young people from the general population of the areas I will be mentioning. And of course, there are also researchers and PhD students that have helped me with my work. So I wanted to start with my thanks to them. So first of all, I wanted to say, I'm not going to bore you with the extensive body of evidence that now has been in fact summarized in 4 large meta-analyses, which is the way we use to make sense of all the body of research that have been published on a topic. And we also publish an editorial, which I think is quite a nice summary of what is out there in terms of evidence of the link between using cannabis and later developing a psychotic disorder, which is something called Cannabis Use Risk of Psychosis, What Degree of Proof Do We Need? There's still some doubts out there, people raise questions, but I think there is a large body of evidence that makes a clear link between the two. And in some way, these evidence come to my face whenever I go to my clinic in inner city London. I actually work in Lambeth. And the 2 main research questions I'm going to share with you, I guess the answer, or beginning of the answer, come from the people I work with, so from my young patients. The first one they usually ask me is that, well, Dr. Di Forte, don't call me Dr. Di Forte, call me Dr. Marta. When you say to us that maybe cannabis has contributed to the onset of my illness, how comes all my mates are still out there in the community using cannabis and they're not here? And this is a very important question. We're not talking about a cause that you use cannabis and everybody, 100% of those that use it, develop psychotic disorder. This is a minority of people, a proportion of people. And so it's very, very important to be able to understand who are those out there who are using cannabis and are at risk of developing a psychotic disorder. And this is a very important question to me and I guess to them. And the second one, and I guess one of the possibility, what this silly question of Shakespeare is trying to say is that maybe one of the differences between those who come to my attention, I guess, or to develop mental health problem if they use cannabis and the one that don't, is how much they use, so the size of the joint, the number of joints, and maybe also we'll see together the type of cannabis they actually use. And the second one is more a question that I get from very nasty reviewers when I try to publish a paper. And the point they're making is, if the number of people out there that use cannabis has increased, how comes that we haven't seen any changes in what we call the rate, for instance, of schizophrenia or in general psychotic disorder? And this is a very important question and we'll get to this at the end. But it's quite good etiquette when you talk about somebody or something that you actually introduce them properly. So I like to start with actually introducing cannabis, or if you like, cannabis sativa, which is the plant where the cannabis that people consume comes from. And I'm going to start from London because we have actually some consistent published data from the Home Office that can tell us a little bit about what's out there in the streets. And you don't have to be a botanicist. I don't know, are they clear, the images at the back? Do you need a bit less lights, or is that okay? because I want this to be, especially these images are quite important. So as I said, you don't need to be a botanicist to be able to spot the difference between this and this. For those of you who like gardening, you can tell that the one on your right, it's much denser in what are the fluorescent parts of the plant, which is also the part of the plant that contains the active ingredient. And this one is the type of cannabis that in the streets of UK at least is known as skunk. And it's not a coincidence, it's called skunk because of its smell. And again, the smell is nothing else than the result of this high density concentration of the active ingredient. And then you have something like this, which is called soap bar. Actually today you find it more in pellets, so much smaller size. And it's what traditionally we would call hashish or resin. You might wonder why I'm bothering you with all these details. But actually it is quite important because these three types not only look very different, and you're probably not going to know what I want to say because this is not moving. Anyway, they don't only look very different, they're also different in terms of the content of their active ingredient. So first of all, when we talk about cannabis and active ingredient, we will talk about cannabinoids, and now we know there are up to 144 of them in the cannabis plant. But as in mental health, we're really very interested in two of them, which I'll be referring throughout my talk. One is, I will refer it shortly as THC, which stands for delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, and the other one is CBD, cannabidiol, but I will talk about THC and CBD. Now, you expect in this one, which we'll call traditional weed or grass or imported herbal, to contain, on average, between 4 to 5% of THC, and practically no of the other one, of CBD. This is something that we know because the Home Office in 2008 was able, with the collaboration of the Met Police, to publish what we call the first Potency study. So a study where they analyze a large number of samples that the police has seized, both from personal search and also big operation, and say, when you come across in London and other 5 areas of UK, or something like this, you expect on average 4 to 5% THC. When you come across this, again, you expect 4 to 5% of THC, but the very big difference is that in hashish, you also find the same amount of CBD, cannabidiol, and we'll see later on, if we can change the slides, why this is important. And crucially, when you come across skunk, you come across something that contains, on average, up to 14% of THC. So we're talking about 10 times greater than this and then this. And again, there is no CBD in skunk. This is quite interesting, and data have been reported again this year in 2018 by, if you like, a replication of the Potency study to suggest that skunk remains in, at least this one was done in London, as strong as before, so we're still around 14%. And more importantly, don't worry about the slides, we still can cover these slides, and these are actually quite important points. On this type of cannabis is pretty much disappearing in UK, which we'll see why might has consequences on public health. So what my next slide is going to tell us is, why should we bother with knowing what type of cannabis people use? And I'm going to ask you a question while we wait. If I was here talking to you about alcohol consumption and effect on mental health or even liver disease, would you be happy if I only ask you the question, have you ever used alcohol, yes or no? Do you think that would be good enough for me to estimate your risk? So if I ask you, have you ever used alcohol, yes or no, how many would put a hand up? So I would be very surprised if all of you are on the road to develop a serious liver disorder. What I would want to know is what type of alcohol you use. I'm sure you all know that it's very different to have a bottle of lager a day than a bottle of whiskey. And also I would want to know how long you've been consuming alcohol. And usually we translate this in units. with cannabis, it's been very difficult to do something as sensible as now we can do with alcohol. Most of the research have been based on, have you used cannabis, yes or no? And this idea of beginning to ask people about type is really not discovering anything more sensible than discovering sliced bread. It's about saying, well, if you really want to understand if there are harms related to the consumption of cannabis, how do we estimate it? And when we ask people about cannabis use, which are the questions the GP, parents, friends, people in education, this is, should actually ask, rather than sticking to, are you using cannabis, yes or no? And so my work really has been about trying to, actually this was my PhD, see, well, if I ask a bit more question about cannabis use, can I make more sense of the link between cannabis and psychosis? I don't know while we're pausing if there is anything you want to ask me about these first few slides or the first few comments I've made, so we can pass the time and you don't get bored. Because I also can see you're beginning to wonder what's going on with this keynote speech. Or maybe you had some question from the article if you read it, yes?
If someone is using grass they call grass, is it most likely to be scammed?
Well, I think I can tell you from the 2018 study that if you are in London, they actually, in a new study, analyzed 350 samples. And again, people usually say, oh, this is not all of the sample available in London, but it's a snapshot, a random snapshot from the Met Police. So only 1% of the sample are expected to be hashish, none are expected to be grass, the rest is skunk. So the problem is that I see this with the young people I work with. When I ask them, what do you use? And they say, skunk, how does it look like? Like grass. I mean, of course, it's an herbal product. But there is a picture, a funny picture of me, where I actually went through this sample. And if you do go through this sample, the smell is so strong that although it looks like grass, most young people out there, they do know it's not traditional grass, it's skunk. And I can tell you another anecdote. In our catchment area, the Rastafarian community is very prominent. This is where there are lots of Afro-Caribbean living. The Rastafarian they absolutely hate skunk. What they use is still traditional grass, which they produce themselves. They actually grow their own traditional weed. And again, it looks like they're both bit of a plant. The only one that looks different is the raisin. And the problem we have at present is that it's very difficult. Somebody comes to me, sometimes people come to me and say, can you tell me what's in what I'm using? I can't. It's not legal. I can't take from people what they are buying from drug dealers and take it to my lab, which is the only reason we use Metropolitan Police samples, because that's the only way we have access to what's out there in the community. Oh, there we go.
We're ready to go now.
Very good. Thank you very much.
Do you want to give us a nod when you're ready to change the slide? So I think we can do from down here rather than...
I can come. I can come. If I don't give you headache by moving, I'll do that because it's easier for me with, I know what's coming next.
Okay. Sorry about that, everyone.
No, don't worry. So you know this by now. So you know, actually I said 14% is 16% skunk, but the rest you know. So the crucial thing to remember, hashish has got both THC and CBD. The other two don't have CBD. That's the main really thing to remember. But what I wanted to, am I bothering you, Filippa, here?
No, you're fine.
What I wanted to discuss with you, so why does type matter? Well, we were able to invite to participate into a study a very large number of young people who were presenting to the South London and Mosley NHS Trust with psychosis for the first time, and an equally large sample of young people from the general population of the same catchment area. And we wanted them to represent who lives out there. We didn't want friends and family of the researcher, sometimes happens in this study. And we asked them extensively about their cannabis history among lots of other important information. And then we put together what we had collected as data on how frequently they were using, together with the type of cannabis they were reporting to use. And I don't know how well you can read in the back, but all I want you to see is how these blue bars are going up. That's the main point. And the key point is that this one that says 1 is really the people that never use cannabis. So these are people that never touch cannabis in their lifetime. And when you compare any of the other bars to this one, you find that, to get to the conclusion quickly, if you report having using skunk type of cannabis, the one we saw in the previous slide, every day, you increased your chances to develop a psychotic disorder of 5 times. If you are familiar with the epidemiology of psychosis, you know that the risk factors we've been able to describe so far, even the one that consistently shown to give an effect, they very rarely go up to increasing the risk of 5-fold. It's not 100% by all means, but it's a significant increase. And people get very interested in this group. They say, oh, look, this is less than 1. What is going on? And this is what happens to people that have used hashish less than once a week, hashish weekends, or hashish every day. And they think, oh, well, this is quite good. This is hope. Maybe if I use hashish, I don't actually get psychosis. Well, we'll see if this is true or what this means. But I think what is important is that certainly using skunk every day is not a good news in terms of increasing your probability of developing a psychotic disorder. I show these slides because sometimes when you publish a study, of course it's very good for your career, but you wonder, has it had any impact? Do people care about what I worked on? And I don't know about the young people, but there is somebody who's quite prominent in this country who seems to take notice of what we publish, and now when she gets a sample of cannabis, she sniffs it to make sure it's not skunk. This is actually true. This is actually a sample of cannabis who was given to the Queen as a present, but clearly she didn't try it. But something more important to me as a psychiatrist working in a mental health service was also to try and see if I could quantify, when I looked at the question of skunk, the number of new people with psychosis come into our service from the specific catchment area where we work that we could actually prevent if we had got rid of skunk. And all this slide is saying is that if we did abolish skunk in our catchment area, we could prevent 24% of the new cases of psychosis. Now, 24% of young people now having psychosis for me is a big deal. And again, there are risk factors for psychosis that are very difficult to prevent. This is something that, at least through public education, we can give people a choice. We can empower people to decide how they want to handle mental health, if you like. So, something quite important as well is the issue of not just people developing a psychotic disorder, but the age of when psychosis for the first time, at 3 years. And she compared the one that during these 3 years had continued to use cannabis, and again, she looked specifically at the one who had used skunk over these 3 years, with the one that had stopped. And what she found that, and even if you can't see this red circle, what he's saying is that the one that had been using skunk after the onset of their psychosis were 3 times more likely to be readmitted to hospital, if they were readmitted to hospital, to stay in hospital longer, and overall to have more relapses. So there is this consistent effect. Skunk, we find, increases your probability to develop psychosis in the first place. It anticipates your age of onset, and it has a bad impact on your clinical, and actually we have measure of functional outcome as well. So it was not just about having residual symptoms, but also going back to Philippa's story at the beginning, having difficulties in going to the co-op and feeling independent and being able to look after yourself. So, having a break from South London, because I do understand this can sound very parochial. I mean, the world doesn't begin and end in the Mosley, luckily. So let's go a little bit beyond and into Europe while we can. And this is of course I'm Italian, so I feel very strongly about this, I apologize. So this is a picture of an indoor plantation of cannabis, which actually has not been taken very far, probably from where you live, because it comes from Yorkshire. And these are the 2 husband and wife living next door and wondering why their neighbor always had the light on, given that we're all usually quite cautious with our electricity bill. And the reason is that they are growing skunk inside. This is actually a serious business. The Metropolitan Police is spending lots of time. Last winter, they were going around with a helicopter on top of Manchester area or Yorkshire main cities, spotting snow, knowing that the no snow most of the time meant indoor plantation of cannabis. And in fact, you can also find this easily online, a sort of guide to have your own indoor plantation. And although this might sound sort of funny, the reason I'm saying it, because this country is self-sufficient on skunk production. We actually don't import any skunk. Traditionally, we were used to import cannabis from either the Far East, or from India or from Morocco, specifically hashish. We don't do hashish anymore, we stick to skunk, and so this might rescue the economy, and this is what actually worries me seriously. So this is beyond the English Channel. So we still have some data that come from London and Cambridge, in fact, but then there are altogether 16 sites across Europe, and one from Brazil, where we were able to do a large-scale version of what I showed you earlier on. So this is a very large group of people that across Europe agreed to participate into our study, and there are two groups, some who had developed psychosis for the first time, and then again the population control from each of the catchment area. And as you can imagine, because I was involved, we asked about cannabis. And it was a bit of a headache, because it was already a headache to establish in London roughly what you expect in terms of THC and CBD when you talk about a type of cannabis that people use. And in fact, we tried in 2018 to redo what the Home Office had done before. And the reason I'm showing you this is actually a classic hard suitcase, large suitcase that you would go on holiday with, which in this case is filled with 350 samples of skunk, which I had to transport on the London Underground. Luckily, I mean, I had a Home Office license, don't get me wrong, but I was very worried about this because it really smelled very strongly. And I had to wear a white coat when we opened it up, and again, despite that, I smelled, I think, maybe it was just me, but I felt I smelled for days. I was actually quite worried about my dog reaction one. I mean, she's a Labrador, so she's quite good with her sniffing. But in London, we really didn't do anything else that confirmed that skunk was as high as before, no greater, no lower, and that there were pretty no sample available of hashish. Out of 350, only 9 of them, the police was able to identify to give it to us, so we could analyze where hashish. And there was no weed or imported alcohol at all. But you can imagine what happens when you leave London and you have to make sense of what the type of cannabis in Spain, in France, and in Italy. The Netherlands was an easy job. You can go to, how many of you have been to a coffee shop in the Netherlands? I don't want to know to do what, just to visit. Okay. So you know there are menus, and you know that on the menu you not only see the name, but you can see the percentage of the active ingredient. And this is because the law is like this. And so the government in the Netherlands every year publishes a report that summarizes what you can actually find in the coffee shop. So for the Netherlands was an easy job. For the rest of Europe, luckily, this section of the EU, the European Monitoring Centre for Drugs and Alcohol Addiction, did seem to concentrate when they talked about cannabis actually on potency. And so they had a specific section when they were able to put together data from all the main European countries and say, this is what you find across them. And so on the basis of this data, I imposed a very sort of crude but experimentally valid cutoff and said, well, if people report to you such and such, and I know what to expect inside it, and the concentration of THC has been reported to be, this is actually the other way around, I'm sorry about this. Anyway, this is my last night making the slides better, which clearly didn't work. But anyway, forget about it, I'm going to stand in front of it. So if you have THC equal or greater than 10%, in my study, you would be considered as using high potency. Less than 10% would be low potency. You can imagine it is quite crude, but it was a way to see, even with such a crude estimate, could I make sense of the effect of potency on the chances of developing psychosis? And you can imagine the answer is yes, so I wouldn't present this data. And this is again, so this is the all of the sample across Europe put together. And you see again this going up story. Now the grey bars are what we will call the unadjusted odds ratio, so when I only take into account the effect of cannabis. But of course cannabis is not, we said that, the solo risk factor, so I thought to take into account, which is the green bar, the potential effect of other drugs that people might use. And perhaps we are no great consumer as other parts of Europe, for instance, of cocaine and amphetamine, but Spain and France are. So I did that. So I took into account alcohol, most of the stimulants, cocaine, illegal highs, hallucinogenic, and also some key social demographic. And despite that, you can see we did have a reduction from 5.1 for the everyday high potency users to 3.8, but again, 4 times more likely to develop psychosis. To me, as a clinician, is a big deal. And we have, I guess now we can't talk about hashish anymore, because the hashish across Europe is very different. We just talk about this low and high potency, but we get a sort of similar story. So the bottom line of this is that why should we actually have a differential effect depending on how much THC and either presence or absence of CBD there is in a type of cannabis? Are we beginning to understand a little bit more? So what we know about THC. So these are data from experimental design, either in animal model or even healthy volunteer that have agreed to take part into the study. So forget about young people with psychosis for a moment. So we do know that if you administer THC, you can, which has an effect of something we call the CB1 receptor. So there is something in our body, not only in our brain, throughout our body, which is called the CB1 receptor. So in some way we are made to respond to cannabis, which is quite interesting per se. So if you use or administer THC, you can induce impairment of memory, attention, and learning of new information. And you can induce mostly a state of suspiciousness and paranoid ideas. Hallucination, so hearing voices, is less common, but can happen. But what is very interesting is what happens with the CBD. So CBD has got no effect at all in inducing hallucination. There's no evidence that can induce paranoia or suspiciousness. In fact, there is some claims that might relieve anxiety. And we will see about this a bit more. What it seems to be happening is that CBD can prevent some of the ability of THC to induce psychotic-like experiences. So these are very different compounds. And something else quite important is that the plant, the genetic of the plant, doesn't allow you to produce a lot of CBD and a lot of THC. So if you push genetically and environmentally the plant to look like this, so to be a skunk-like plant, which has got lots and lots of THC, when you actually take it to smoke it, you find that you will have naturally very low CBD. So there's no such a thing as a skunk with lots of THC and lots of CBD, which is very important. So I just wanted to show you one of the several examples of the experimental study that have been done to make the point I was just illustrating to you. So this is Dr. Paul Morrison, who's now moved from the Institute of Psychiatry to Scotland, where he was born, to work as a clinician. And what he did a very interesting study. So he advertised actually for healthy volunteers to be given intravenously 2.5 milligrams of THC. Usually we have lots of difficulties to get volunteers. We had a flood of volunteers coming to have intravenous THC. Some were also colleagues at the Institute of Psychiatry, I should say. And what this graph is just showing you very simply, this is the positive and negative symptom score scale, so just a way to measure if people had developed any positive symptoms, so any sort of bizarre belief or paranoid delusions or even had voices. And these are people who receive placebo. These are healthy volunteers. You can see it makes no difference to them receiving placebo in terms of positive symptoms. And these are the people who receive intravenously THC. You can see that within half an hour, they actually reach a reasonable, what we will call a clinically relevant score on this scale. But then this goes away, luckily. And some of them were actually so unwell that did require some calming medication like benzodiazepine. So this actually was a quite difficult experiment to carry out. And so what Paul wanted to do next was to add a different dimension. So what he did was, he did the experiment again, but to some of the people gave, before the THC injection, some oral CBD. And these are the people that you see here. So you can see that in these people, although they get THC intravenously, because they get CBD before then, they don't really have a significant increase of the score of the PANSS. So they don't really develop clinically relevant symptoms. These are the people that get placebo, which of course have got exactly the same picture, just getting THC alone. So that he showed, and again, he's not the only one that's done that giving CBD before THC, or if you like, together with THC, has a very different story than just having THC on its own, which might bring us back to one of my first slides on using hashish, where you have the same amount of THC and CBD. How many of you have heard of a drug which is licensed in this country called Sativex? So Sativex, So Sativex until very recently was the only cannabis-based medication that was licensed in our country, in UK, which is actually prescribed for multiple sclerosis. There were the trials that look at Sativex and they look at the side effect profile, they did not report psychosis. But one characteristic of Sativex is that it's got 2.7% THC and exactly the same amount of CBD. So it's got this 1-to-1 ratio of the two active ingredients. So why should cannabis have any effects on our brain, on the rest of our physiology? So I was saying to you that there is this receptor called CB1, and in fact there are two receptors, also CB2, and now we know there are others, who are part of our body. We are made with them inside us. And the reason for this is that in 2008, so actually quite after I completed medical school, so I had to learn by myself about this. How many of you have heard about the endocannabinoid system? Well, it's probably, Professor Mari, I don't want you to put your hand up. And actually, you have heard very recently, not in medical school. But if I ask this question to my colleagues, actually, most of them haven't heard about it. And when I say colleagues, I don't mean medics, I mean psychiatrists, which I think worries me. So the endocannabinoid system was really described firstly in the late 2000s, so quite recently. In 2008, the first compound called endocannabinoid, because it's something that we produce and binds to the receptor CB1 and CB2 that the cannabis compound also binds when they enter our body. But all you need to know is that we have something called the endocannabinoid system, which switches on in uterus, so even before we're born, very early in life, and stays with us until we die, and has got a crucial role in protecting all our central nervous system in developing. But also it's got lots of other function, because these receptors are throughout the body. So I'm just going to, I know you will have the chance to look at the slides, but also you can look at the original review from Nature, which is very nice, which tells you that this endocannabinoid system regulates appetite, memory, alertness, pain, inflammation, bone marrow, eat, sleep, relax, forget, basically pretty much everything that matters to us and our well-being. So it is not a surprise that now we're beginning to hear about medicinal cannabis, because there are probably ways you can affect all these functions in a beneficial manner. But one thing I want you to remember, because we're talking about mental health, is that actually the endocannabinoid system, when it comes to protecting the central nervous system, so the brain function, is not on all the time. It's not like your thyroid gland that it produces its hormone all the time, otherwise we won't be able to be alive. It's something that comes on only when it's needed. So normally is silent. But if we have a head injury, we fall off our bike and we bash our head, or if we have a stroke, or if we have an epileptic seizure for people who suffer from epilepsy, at these times the endocannabinoid system gets activated. So it's called on demand, which is very unusual in our physiology. And so it gets activated because what it does is that at the time where the brain is under stress, is under sort of a threat, he produces a variety of substances and activates these two receptors I told you, and it's like he develops a virtual safety helmet. And he does that, I'm sure you're all familiar with glutamate and GABA, I'm not going to bore you with this, but to give you the example, stroke. If we have a stroke, glutamate's level in our brain shoot up, which is actually one of the reasons why stroke have bad consequences in the long term, because too much glutamate kills neuron. Now, what the endocannabinoid system does, it keeps glutamate under control. Too much GABA is not a good idea either. You know, if you take too much benzo, what happens to you? So you want the right amount of these two for our brain to be healthy. And this is what this safety helmet does. So in an era where, well, when I actually prepared the slide, I was going to say we're going towards medicinal cannabis. Medicinal cannabis is here. It came along on the 1st of November. I think we need to remember, and we need to know more. And when I say we need, I mean professionals that are going to be potentially prescribing cannabis compound for whatever health reason need to know about the endocannabinoid system. And this is what comes my way. So this is a study that was published by Professor Phil McGuire at the Institute of Psychiatry, which started to see if you could use CBD, so again a cannabis compound, for psychosis. And this is what we call an adjunctive treatment. So the people recruiting in the study were people who were suffering with a psychotic disorder, who were already on an antipsychotic, just one each, one mainstream antipsychotic, and were offered either to add placebo or to add CBD. And the bottom line of all of this writing is that there was an improvement on both clinical symptoms and also level of functioning. The only improvement, which was just about okay, was on cognition. And this was 600 milligram of CBD on daily basis. But this is really the only double-blind trial that has been published on psychosis. So I know how sensible and cautious you are about medication, and I prescribe them, so I have to be too. I wouldn't necessarily launch into prescribing CBD left and right because of one trial, but it's definitely something very promising, and now there are funding that have been put into research in making this on a much larger scale, because we're talking about 88 subjects. So it might be, talking about hope, that there is a hope in terms of being able to use at least CBD in psychosis. And I'm going to get to my conclusion with an example, and I can see Professor Murray making a funny face. He doesn't like my example, but I'm very keen on this. So everybody knows aspirin, so I'm sure it's familiar to you. Most of you would have used it at some point in their lifetime. And this is an example that I want to use to tell you about the concept of medicinal cannabis. People say cannabis is very good because it comes from a plant. Acid-acetyl-salicylic is a natural compound. It comes from a plant too. And we know it can be used for lots of stuff and be extremely effective, but the only reason we're allowed to prescribe it is because we equally know the side effect very well. And something very important to me, we know that you should never give aspirin to a child or an adolescent, because otherwise you want to prevent the fever from going up, you precipitate a very rare disease, which is actually most of the time lethal, which is an encephalitis. So we can prescribe it because we have contraindication, we know most importantly how much, how long, and to whom. Now, can we say the same about cannabis? And I'm going to start with this positive, hopeful slide. There are now data that suggest you can use it in pain control, in particular condition. We know it's been used in multiple sclerosis already with Sativex. You have heard from the news that there are specific form of childhood epilepsy where CBD, high concentration of CBD preparation can be very effective. For everything else, we need more evidence. And I guess when people accuse me to campaign against cannabis, I don't campaign against anything, but I'm interested in the side effects. I just want to make sure that when we launch into prescribing furiously for any of this, we know exactly what to look for, and we know how to minimize the side effect side. And to do that, we need to know to whom, how much, and for how long. And unfortunately, even for most of this condition, except multiple sclerosis, we don't actually know that completely. So I'm going to just conclude with my last slide, which was about 2 slides about the effect on the general population. If we're going to see an increase of cannabis consumption, not just recreationally, but in terms of medicinal use, because people might think, oh, I want to go and get cannabis because I know I can treat myself for all this condition. Do we need to worry at the population level? So this is a slide, and if you haven't seen this study, it's very interesting, and I would recommend you see it. And people are looking at this and getting distracted. I'll tell you what this is about, unless you know already. This is a slide of a study published in February this year, which tells you how this idea that clinicians have been promoting that psychosis is a disease which is the same across the world, it's nonsense. As most complex disease varies across the world, this is to tell you how the incidence of the number of new cases of psychosis per 100,000 of each population of the sites of our study varies of tenfold, with London having the highest number of new cases per 100,000 per year. And this little one here is my city of birth, Filippo, so you talk about Yorkshire.
Palermo.
So, Palermo. So I was born in Palermo with only an incidence of 11.2 and made a bad choice of moving to a place where it's 61.6. But never mind, anyway. So what I wanted to see is that, can I make sense of some of this variation in relation to what I know are the way people consume cannabis and the type of cannabis available across these sites. Now, the full story hopefully will come out soon in Lancet Psychiatry, but just one slide to go back to the population attributable fraction, so to the measure of the number of new cases that we can estimate are attributable to that specific risk factor. So here you have, and I don't know if you can see this in the back, in London, if we abolished the one that here I call Potency, the over 10% THC, we could prevent 31% of new cases of psychosis. In Amsterdam, 50%. I mean, this is huge. I mean, I redid this analysis lots of times because it's almost too much to believe it. And again, in Palermo, you don't have high-potency cannabis. High-potency cannabis is leaking now in Italy. And the funny thing was that we only had 2 people that reported using it, and were 2 controls who had gone to Amsterdam on holiday and tried it and came back. But we had otherwise nobody in the sample who had actually, because it's not available. And it's like saying, you know, is alcohol a contributor to liver disease in a country where alcohol is not consumed? So this actually tells us that when you look at differences of how any health problem presents, you also need to see how different is the distribution of those factors that contributes to its onset. And I actually want to say, well, this is a summary, but I want to say this. So you have now a clinical advisory board, Filippa, is that right? Yes. I would be very keen on your input on this. So the point is that, what do you do? Well, one thing I can do is that for the young people I see, to offer them a space where if they want to stop cannabis, they get adequate support and access to intervention, but also a place where people can get information about this. Both young people with psychosis, their family, clinician, medical students. And so we got some money from the mostly charitable funds. As you know, it's one of the charitable organizations linked to our institution, to start a cannabis clinic, which will be launched on the 31st of January. And we're just beginning to think, what do we need and what we should do. And we are going to involve some of the young people with psychosis, of course, because they need to be the center of the project. But if you want to come and check if we're doing something sensible, or if you have any advice, or if any of you as family members want to be involved, because I would also like to have a specific section which supports you not only from information, but also gets your feedback on what your experience is in relation to cannabis and psychosis, please do email me, because at least until the 31st of January, we have time to make things better. And I think that's it. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Marta, and thank you on 2 counts. First of all, for sharing your presentation and your findings in such an engaging way, and second of all, for dealing with the technological difficulties so admirably. So thank you. And we've got around 5 minutes for any questions. So we're going to try and take questions in kind of groups of 2 or 3. So if we could just, I think there's someone with their hand up in the in the middle of the room.
Hello, my name is Aparna. I want to ask, what are your views on cannabis cafes which are opening in England and they are not legalized, but I heard some police commissioner or who's retired, they were trying to find out whether they should legalize. So would that be good enough to give them advice on this matter? Because it seems a lot of people go to that joint to smoke cannabis.
I think the police retired officer you're mentioning is Bernard Hogan Howe, who was the sort of head of the Metropolitan Police. He's aware of this. He's actually aware of this data, and I think is sort of quite keen to monitor. I think the problem is CBD is legal in this country. It's not actually classified as an illicit drug. So lots of these cafes have opened to sell CBD-based products, which is the reason why they're allowed to exist. Now, it's really a police matter to go and check if they're not also smoking THC or skunk. And I guess from my point of view, all I can do is to make sure that people out there do know the risk. I'll give you a bit of an example, tobacco. We have put in place lots of policies, who of course have made a big difference in the tobacco consumption. But from my point of view as well, it's been important to give people the information they need to make a choice. And also to give them a choice to stop and intervention to stop if they want to. And this is where I want to go with cannabis. Because I also know of lots of groups that you can find. If you go online, although it's illegal in this country, there are lots of people advertising cannabis groups where you can go in people's houses and smoke and consume cannabis in lots of ways. So I personally don't have any control over that. The only thing I can, not control, but contribute is information, if that makes sense.
Thank you. Can you just take a question at the very back of the room, please?
Yeah, sure. I'm David Guinness. I used to be National Chair of the Manic Depression Fellowship. I have a friend in London who's a practicing psychotherapist, and he's contracted liver cancer. And he reckons that cannabis kills cancer cells. What's your comment on that?
Well, my comment is I'm afraid there's no evidence. If you look at the literature, which I've actually done, there are not studies who have proven that cannabis cures cancer. What they have shown is that patients who have cancer and they are experiencing pain or they can get relief from smoking cannabis.
Right.
And between you and I, if somebody is terminally ill, it's up to them what they do to feel better.
Yes.
I mean, my concern is young people who otherwise are absolutely fine and getting on with their life,
Yes.
bombarding their brain or their endocannabinoid system, if you like, with cannabis.
Yes.
But in terms of the evidence for cannabis, there are very few animal models that are looking at this question, but
Yes.
they are not human studies who have a definite answer on that.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much.
You're very
for that.
welcome.
Yeah.
Thank you, thank you. We'll take probably two more questions. So if we can have one question down at the front here, and then perhaps the gentleman in the purple shirt behind, please.
Hi. You started off with a question that some of your, well, they're not patients, but service users might have asked you, which was, why have I developed psychosis through smoking skunk, but lots of my mates haven't? And presumably, I mean, that's obviously not the question that your research is about, but presumably that is because of the more recent research on genes, that some people have a susceptibility, a propensity towards schizophrenia, but might never get it.
You're absolutely right. So the first part of it, as you remember, in my question I didn't mention skunk. So the first part of my question has been answered by the fact that what you use and how much you use can make a difference between you and your mates. And the second one, which we're trying to address now, is that even among skunk users who use it every day, not everybody develops psychosis. And so we're looking at the genetics. So one thing we're doing right now is exactly what you said. We're seeing if the genes that have been now shown to increase the susceptibility for psychosis as a whole have a role in this. So I can tell you what we have found. So we have found that if you do have a big load of these genes, because we're talking about not one or two, we're talking about hundreds. Yes, so if you think about when Robin talked about the polygenic risk score, so people who have a high polygenic score, if to that you add cannabis, it's definitely not a good news. And I think that would be the case for any risk factors. Think about obstetric complication. Probably if you're born with obstetric complication and also a high genetic load, that's not a good news. So, but what I'm trying to look as well is more specifically, can we actually use the information we have from the genes for schizophrenia, and see if there is a specific set of this gene that tell us really what is the underlying biology of why cannabis causes psychosis. Because until we find that, we will not be able to actually use cannabis as well as we can to understand or look at better treatment option, if that makes sense. But I think your question is absolutely right. You have a high genetic load for psychosis. Adding cannabis is not a good news.
Thank you. And final question, the gentleman in the purple shirt, please, just behind.
Hi there, thank you for coming. I've been diagnosed with psychosis before, and I have never took any drugs, cannabis. I've not even smoked a cigarette. And I appreciate there's a link between cannabis and psychosis, but I feel like it's quite well known in the public now, but psychiatrists seem to be pushing it a lot, and I've been asked many times, sometimes 5 times, worded differently in one session, if I take cannabis or any sort of drugs. And I feel like there's a stigma as well to drug use, and almost like the stigma applies to me. And I just wonder, is there other research other than cannabis that causes psychosis? Because there must be. I've read about the fact that if you're in an urban area, you're more likely to get psychosis than someone that lives in the country. And I was just wondering, could you highlight other causes of psychosis besides cannabis?
You're absolutely right. I mean, cannabis by all means is one of the contributing risk factors. And I guess I talked about cannabis because this is what I'm interested in. And also because I know it's something we can do, use it for prevention. I mean, urban city, living in urban city, between you and I, it's definitely one of the most replicated risk factors. But what do? Do we all go back to the countryside? I mean, there's one thing we can do. We can inform developers in how they should build healthier cities, because I think our cities are dreadful for mental health, let alone psychosis. But if you want to know more about the other sort of causes, which you are right, and I'm sorry you feel stigmatized, I think maybe one thing psychiatrists should learn better is how to ask questions. I never ask people, do you take cannabis or do you take drugs? I said, tell me a bit about your lifestyle. What do you do in your time off? Because I think it is a dreadful thing to do, to assume that because you have experienced psychosis, you take drugs or you've been a victim of abuse or whatever. Because all of us has a different story, and we can come, unfortunately, to sometimes the same outcome by different pathways. But if you want, if you send me an email, I can send you some nice summary article that look at the literature on all the variety of risk factors that have been described so far. And by all means, Professor Murray is the one that has contributed to all of it, so he'll be able to help with some papers.
Thank you. Thank you very much.